What is going on? And welcome back to the Phoenix channel. Today is Sunday, March the 28th. If you like this content, consider hitting that like button. Consider subscribing to this channel. Alright, so we got the EOS Chestahedron rocking today. A small one, guys. I still have actually not had anybody take me up on the open source SLA file for that. It's free. There's no cost really that I'm getting with it. So it's just something that is being given away. So if you want to make your own, you can. You don't need to use any particular vendor. I think you could just take that 3D file and take it to either your own 3D printer and instruct it to create that file through plastic or metal, or you can go to basically rent a 3D printer somewhere else and get it printed. But pretty cool. It makes a pretty cool piece of jewelry, I think. And it does come with the design with the notched holes, so you're able to put basically attach it on a chain, which is pretty neat. And it's a decent size, that it's not super crazy, but it's I think a super neat looking piece. I also got some bigger ones, but I think those are for special occasions. So yeah, let me know if you're interested in that. Today we're going to be going over the sovereign individual in relation to Dan Larimer's proposal for the Eden governance initiative. And it just so happens that the sovereign individual has a section in the book. So this is the sovereign individual, for those that have not seen it. It's by James Dale Davidson and Lord William Rees-Mogg. And they have a section here called The East of Eden, the Agricultural Revolution and Sophistication of Violence. And so this goes into some discussions about how society, humans have evolved over time, starting from hunter and gatherers, in which there was, in some ways, folks could view that as a primitive means of living, but in other ways was actually pretty advantageous from the perspective of high cost of imposing violence on others, because hunter-gatherers, in a sense, did not have means of storing food, and hunter-gatherers, from just a way of life, required vast distances between small groups. And so this meant the cost of attacking another group was fairly high, because you'd have to traverse maybe thousands of miles to do that, right? And not only that, but there was nothing for you to steal, because there was no storage of food. So it wasn't until really the agricultural revolution, in which improvements in the productivity of farming and more organization on crops and livestock, where started to also see techniques of storing food really came to be. And that gave rise to violence, because there was forms of things to steal. And so that then resulted in groups paying others to, quote, protect them, because of unequal measures of weaponry and really jackals, right, that were out there that were looking for things to take. And so this over time created more of this feudal state, because of the high cost of risk with not only violence, but also just the economic cost, right, then of weather conditions, lower margins of profitability. So if you ran into some type of a weather issue, vast droughts, for example, it actually meant that you might not make it, right? Your family may not make it that year. So rather than do that, a lot of society felt that it was more advantageous to put that burden on the landlord to provide seeds and food and water. So initially it was seen as a very advantageous way to minimize risk, but it led to something in the book I thought was interesting. It led to this behavior of a feature, really, risk aversion. And it basically, in the lower tiers of society. So It says here, taboos and social constraints limited experimentation and innovative behavior, even at the obvious cost of foregoing potentially advantageous improvements in settled ways of doing things. This was a rational reflection of the fact that experimentation increases the variability of results. Greater variability means not only potentially greater gains, but more ominously, for those at very margin of survival, potentially ruinous results. And so a great part of the cultural energy of poor farming societies has always been devoted to suppressing experimentation. This repression, in effect, was their substitute for insurance policies. If they had insurance or sufficient savings to self-insure their experiments, such strong social taboos would not be needed to help ensure survival. So what this means is basically groups at the margin that have no means to essentially really take on these risks didn't really do them, and actually became a self-reinforcing downward spiral because they couldn't, that the perceived cost of undertaking the risk was deemed too high to even do it. And so it says that behaviors is actually culturally programmed, and for the vast majority of agricultural societies, culture programmed them for survival, but little more than survival in an environment where the luxury of participating in open markets was reserved to others. And so when we think about something like Eden as a governance network, it's really goes beyond just, I think, spurring some initial efforts to build tools for the EOS network. It potentially means there's a sovereign means for this community to basically create its own digital citizenry, right? Away from the current system. And that, even as primitive as it might be today, with I think the start of about $2 million for the top prize within this EOS playoff system, and lower prizes or lower awards, I shouldn't call them prizes, lower awards of, I think it's like 20,000 US dollars at the current price, at the current state or cost of EOS, show, I think, tremendous promise if we can balance accountability and reputation in it. Also beyond that, this reputation, this theory of reputation on a network, on a global network, individual reputations and clans of reputations of clans and groups, has other potential applications. I mean, you go back to years ago now, we talked about how businesses, the business logics themselves could be reinvented, and a good portion of that, a huge, I think, important building block within any business or cooperation between individuals, right? Trust, that's another word for trust. The linkage between them and their relationships is a form of trust. A part of that is how much do you trust these people to honor the rules of a society. And so we have trustless systems that exist today, and I know that it will always remain to be an element of decentralized applications. But part of, sophisticated applications that we use today, to some degree, still require some levels of reputation and trust, high reputation and good trust between users, right? If you're going to get into an Uber, a decentralized Uber, for example, you want to know that you can trust that person. If you want to maybe start a cooperative, a land cooperative with others, you want to have some means that for the history of time there's been no disputes, or if there was disputes, how they've been resolved and what the community stands for, right? And so understanding where people stand on certain positions, whether they agree with you or disagree, isn't the I guess the feature is to know where they stand. And so this potential Eden, this governance system may actually do that as it evolves. I mean, we're only seeing the very early innings of this, but that's what excites me. But that was the peasant insurance back in the day, guys. It was landlords, because the risk of cost to do it on their own was just deemed so high that they actually never would do it. And so I think that has parallels to today's financial system. We live in a society today where the cost is deemed tremendously high to maybe even become an entrepreneur or take on risk outside the current system, because it provides some means of stability. But the same elements of that system also create this risk aversion towards new technologies that thereby continues to undermine the individual or groups who are trying to gather sovereignty, right? So it's actually the anti-thesis of what's needed for any group of individuals, particularly I think those groups in our society which have been marginalized for decades and centuries. And so it makes this chapter, that type of understanding, I think, makes it very clear why the thesis for EOS and Bitcoin are solidified, because the current system doesn't provide a means to do experimentation in the same ways that potentially this other system allows, with lower barriers to entry and the ability to fail, because you might be unable to experiment, for example, with just yourself, because you don't maybe have the financial means to do it. So the barrier, for example, to create a reinvented business model or even open up your own shop might be very high. But if you were to crowdfund that with hundreds or thousands of people, okay, that current arrangement within your community, something that would almost be perceived as impossible to do. In this book, they call it actually a taboo. So it talks about taboos and social constraints, limited experimentation, and innovative behavior, even at the obvious cost of foregoing potentially advantageous improvements in settled ways of doing things. So meaning these experimentations and different forms of trial could actually result in a better way of life for people, but they were they're still deemed as taboo just because of this risk aversion. And so a lot of the society back then and a lot of society today is devoted to suppressing experimentation for the benefit, in my opinion, of stability, right? Stability of the current systems. And so really one of the things, or one of the key things for people to focus on is their own insurance. And so it talks about here that the repression, the societal, I guess you'd call it the risk aversion. The risk aversion was there because individuals lacked real insurance for themselves to actually perform experimentation. But as maybe certain individuals received some means to have their own insurance policies, i.e. through savings, if they had insurance or sufficient savings to self-insure their experiments, such strong social taboos would not be needed to help ensure survival. And so what that means, I think, for many of us in EOS and within the crypto space is have some insurance. You know, going all in on something, going substantially in something is fine. And you know, your boy Phoenix is like that. Your boy Phoenix is not messing around. I'm like the pleb version. I'm the pleb version of Michael Saylor on EOS, I think, right now. Maybe behind my boy, or maybe alongside Felix Staffelbaker, shout out to that guy, buying up different digital assets because I view them as advantageous over the current system. But having said that, it's important to take a reasonable view on things. And so for me, that means instructing my fellow EOS plebs to have preparations in order to sustain yourself for the likes of 2, 3, 4 years if needed. I think that actually, and I would argue that we're almost at a point where maybe perhaps one additional cycle, or it could even happen on this cycle, we see what I think a lot of us thought we would see by now: hyper-Bitcoinization and the embracement of digital assets from the mainstream. Now, it hasn't happened yet, but if you've positioned yourself over the last 4 years to save, and stack, I think most of you now are basically like myself, and you can take on that type